Welcome to this sixth session of the second edition of the ACMHangouts hosted by Arts Council Malta. As you know by now, during these sessions, we are inviting professionals, experts, and also creative professionals and practitioners to join our discussion, focusing on a variety of different subjects related to culture and creativity. And more specifically, we are discussing the strategy work which Arts Council Malta is currently focusing on. The sessions are all being streamed on the Arts Council Malta Facebook page and are then available should you want to check them out at a later date. Today we are focusing on the subject of policy and strategy in the cultural industries. The idea here is to explore the role of policies and strategies within the cultural and creative industries and to understand exactly what these terms are referring to and also their impact and effect on the sectors. Our panel today to discuss this subject is made up of Adrian De Battista, who is the head of strategy at Arts Council Malta, Mario Azzopardi, director at the Culture Directorate, and Dr. Rachel Scicluna, anthropologist and researcher. Throughout the session, we will also have a number of different speakers who will be joining us through Zoom. So I would now like to give the floor to Adrian for a brief introduction about today's subject.
Thank you, Elaine, for the invitation. So practically, when we talk about policies and strategies, there is a tendency that sometimes we conflate them as well. And of course, it's understandable because there are a lot of links between the two. Of course, the function of a policy might differ a bit than that of a strategy, and we'll get into that later. However, I wanted to firstly focus on the policy aspect, because of course the policy is that which overarches the rest of the conversation. When we look at policies are at their very basic level are meant to solve some form of a problem. So there's some form of identified problem, and policies are formulated in accordance to how this problem is identified and what is considered to be problematic in itself. Thus, when we look at the governance level within which policies are formulated, we can expect that the way these problems are envisaged may vary in multiple ways, because a certain social group might envisage the same problem in a way. Another group might envisage that problem as not a problem, but as something desirable to that social group. So you have a multiplicity of interests that come into play. There are struggles at play. There are different stakeholders. And the process of policy formulation is basically trying to negotiate and balance out these tensions between these different interests. And that's in a very rudimental and maybe conventional way of thinking how policy making and policy formulation is mostly understood. Indeed, the most common way of picturing and imagining how policy is done is usually through this linear formation, where there's a problem which is identified, a policy which is formulated, and then afterwards you get to the evaluation stage. However, in reality, it's much more messy than that, and things are much in real life they get more complicated than what is deemed to be the theoretical aspect of it.
Excellent. So I think we can, I would actually like to start with this messy point which you just mentioned, because it's obviously what makes the policy making interesting and a complex process in itself. So Rachel, how would you describe this process? And I would also like to make a little bit of difference and understand a bit better the relationship between policy and strategies, the resultant strategies in this case.
So, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm absolutely delighted. As Adrian was differentiating, there is a difference between strategy and policy. Now, when we're talking about strategy, more often than not, we are laying out a vision. A vision which is based on a system that will bring together multiple stakeholders. At the core of this system, from my perspective, obviously, as the researcher and the anthropologist, there is culture. So how can this specific strategy be developed and also implemented through channels that are appropriate and relevant to that specific cultural context, and of course to historical processes and politics and economy as well. So how can we combine these 3 or 4 facets in order to come up with something that will actually be successful in the end? So core to this successful strategy and vision would be to base it on a bottom-up approach way of doing research. Now, in anthropology or the use of ethnographic methods, this is exactly what we do. And as Adrian very well said, which is a term which I love, policy is messy because life is messy, because society is messy, because people are.
We are messy.
We are not living in a lab. So
Exactly.
things are not linear. So people might tell you that they need one thing, but then they will do something very differently. So it's important that when you are talking to people, trying to understand their point of view in order to reach that kind of bottom-up perspective, is to see, to observe them, to hang out with them, to spend time with them, and to ask the appropriate questions. Now, one important thing for a policy is its timeliness. Now, this timeliness also depends on the length or period of time that you have in your hands, because sometimes when you are referring to politics or health in general, say if you want to devise a strategy or a policy for health, like what we had with COVID-19, you have to be timely. So how can you then make sure that you're bringing out exactly the needs of the people? And that is obviously by having different, I can call them methods, such as focus groups, for example, or speaking to people repeatedly. And from there, you have to then bring out that data and communicate it to your whoever is commissioning you, whether it is the government, whether it is Arts Council Malta, so on and so forth. But what is really, really important to try and understand, go to the grassroots of that issue. And by going there is by asking questions, and sometimes by also asking the wrong question and making mistakes. Because when you make those mistakes, it's when obviously people will start telling you the other sides of the story.
Exactly. And in relation to the timeliness which you are mentioning, I think that is why then there is a repetition of this exercise every number of years, because it is something which is relevant for now and not relevant maybe in 5 years' time.
Exactly, and I think what we tend to forget is that policy is alive. So policy is not something which is written in stone and it's there to stay as it is, but it actually needs to be continuously informed by research. And that's exactly what we're trying to do differently this time, perhaps, that we are informing this strategy and policy through research instead of doing a desk-based research and say, this is exactly what Malta needs for the creative and cultural sector. No, but Malta has changed, especially since 2013 onwards, I'd say. We've had a very, very, very big shift when it comes to the demographic shift, political shifts. So we also have multiple publics. Malta is not homogeneous, never was, but I think now it's more visible.
Well, I would say what we're going through right now actually contributed to a major shift in how we look at things at our sector, so probably that affects as well in this case.
Absolutely, yes. I think it's a learning curve that we always have to be ready on our feet to actually make sure or ensure that policy is addressing the needs, wants and desires of the communities that we have.
Exactly. Mario, so from your perspective, you obviously worked for a number of years now on policy, in very close relationship with the cultural policy. So how does this translate to the cultural sector, and in a local context, how does it work in terms of structure and in terms of its implementation? Maybe we can also shed some light on the work which you do at the Culture Directorate.
First of all, I would like Rachel, thank you for this opportunity. And Rachel mentioned timeliness. This particular policy has a particular, it started when there was economy booming and everybody was enjoying a lot of culture and different events. We finished writing it in a most unusual way during COVID. So we had to face this shift, if you would like to call it shift, from literally you have everything you need to, it's very difficult even to meet, to conclude the policy. I agree with Adrian, if you allow me, in 95% of what he said. There is something, I see policy more as a set of principles rather than there is a problem and we have to face it. Personally, I see policy more a set of principles which will help us to take rational decision making. It is when we come to strategy where I see that we have to face problems. For example, the strategy, if we were in 2018, I think wouldn't be the same now. Because today we have a problem that we have to face.
And it's a more immediate kind of
for
approach.
the immediate. Timeliness is very important. The first cultural policy was in 2011. It was excellent. It laid the foundations, and I think we have made a lot of progress from 2011 till now. So it was time to have another policy. We even, I think, surpassed what was suggested in 2011, but I insist that it laid the foundations. Now, today, obviously, we have to look beyond what was 2011 because Rachel and Adrian mentioned that, for example, our society has changed. It is much more multicultural, obviously. Yes, it's true. The government is investing much more in culture. I think there is much more awareness about cultural heritage, for example. So yes, the policy now obviously has to address all these issues. Now, when we come to strategies where we have to implement those principles that we are agreeing about, it is, yes, it's true, it's a bottom-up exercise. In fact, when we started drafting, I think one of the first, Adrian was with us, one of the first decisions that we had to take was that it is very important that we rely obviously on statistics that we have, because that is also important that we make use of statistics. But we need to meet people, because at the end of the day, the consumers are the general public. Obviously, they have also first-hand experience. And I think we learned a lot from these 10 meetings, and we also try to reach out to as the widest possible of people. We advertise them so that everybody can attend. I mean, not just the experts. I don't want to say that the experts are not important. They are very important, but we need also to have the input of even of the general public. And I think all of us learned a lot from what they said. So that is, if you allow me, Adrian, that's where we didn't agree.
Would you like to defend your 5%, Adrian, or no? Yes, go ahead.
No, I agree 100% with what you said. That
Speaking of percentages,
that
we're going to be stuck there.
that the policy lays out the principles. My only point of contention was that, like, the principles, in order to be formulated in the first place, as it is generally understood, is that they are there in order to solve some form of preconceived problem of sorts, even if that is not something which is immediately identified. So there's like an assumption about what the need is in certain sectors, and the principles are laid out, and which indeed guide the resulting strategies, which I completely agree with, yes.
Mm-hmm. Just a question for you, Rachel. Do you feel that the processes, like you're now observing the process of developing a strategy for the cultural sectors and maybe other sectors, is there a difference, or you feel that the process of creating a strategy is quite similar?
In general, I would say that the process wouldn't be exactly the same, because you're dealing with a very different type of stakeholder. But however, you still have a very similar overall, perhaps, methodology, where you have to, for example, make sure, as we're all agreeing here, understand what the problem is. And when it comes to devising a strategy, you always have to create and come up with solutions and recommendations. So in order to come up with those, you always have to be completely in touch with the stakeholders. And when I refer to people, I'm not just referring to people as in your citizens, lay people, which are important because, of course, they are the audience, right, that we need to target. But you also have the direct stakeholders that are participating in making art and the creative sector happen. And you have different sectors. You have your independent artists, you have different organizations that are participating, you have your festivals, you have different groups, and all of them need to be seen as a whole. Okay. So to some extent, when you're dealing with a strategy, you are thinking about creating a system or a form of regulation in how communication can be facilitated, but also how then these policy areas or set of principles that are identified can be then implemented. So one of the common things that I see across strategies that I've been involved in is to create a sense of trust with your stakeholders. And through the process itself, there is a sense of ownership. So where there's this sense of ownership, automatically when you come to implement, you have a better outcome.
Exactly.
Let's put it like that.
Exactly.
It might not be perfect, nothing is ever perfect, but the fact that there is, I think what the key term for me would be is engagement as the future as well, because we tend not to engage in dialogue as much in Malta. And I think we're seeing this shift, however. Recently I've observed that there has been a shift even at a political level, that there's this sense of dialogue and openness to move to a future which is more inclusive.
Exactly. I think we'll have the opportunity to go a little bit into more detail about this later on during our conversation. At this point, I would like to take a look at the international context. Obviously, a policy as strategies cannot live on their own in a tiny island. So there's obviously another context. And I'd like to introduce in this conversation Magdalena Moreno Mujica. I hope I spelled that. I pronounced that correctly, who is joining us through Zoom. Magdalena is the Executive Director of IFACA, which is a global network of arts councils and ministries of culture. And essentially, the organization conducts research, provides information and resources to all members and institutions. So, Magdalena, through your work, you do come in contact with a number of countries, a number of cultural organizations. What would you say that in terms of policy implementation are the main different models which are employed? And maybe you can share with us any changes which you noticed over time.
Thank you very much. A real pleasure to be here with you. I'm concerned that my connection is not fantastic, so I hope you can hear me well.
Yes,
and
thank you.
greetings to excellent, and greetings to everybody in Malta, a country that I've had the opportunity to visit a number of times and have a deep love and fond for its people and culture. So greetings all from the other side of the world. I'm based in Sydney, where the Secretariat of the Federation is. It's been really interesting listening to what has been discussed so far in terms of the difference between policies and strategies. Now, for a few years, I was working at the Ministry of Culture in Chile, where I am from originally. And the question of the problem was a question that the Ministry of Social Development, which was the ministry that provided the investment portfolio for culture, we were tasked with us answering the questions of any investment strategy that was presented to the whole of government for consideration within the Treasury process. What problem are you trying to solve and how are you going to solve it? But I do think it was more around strategy than policies, and I would agree with Mario there that I think it's more on the principles. And I think it's also interesting just to mention from, again, my country in Chile is that post-dictatorship, there was a need to ensure that cultural policies were not aligned with the government of the time. So it's quite interesting because I don't think this is very common, but the policies in that country ensure that they go over into at least 1 or 2 years of an incoming government. And so that means that there's a level of continuity and a level of distancing from the political system when it comes to the responsibilities and the principles around what a cultural policy will be delivering on for a country. Then there are other examples around the world where they actually choose not to have, they'll have policies to deliver specific, or rather to address and to have a base to work from that may be specific to the ministries or to the arts councils. But say, for example, Australia doesn't have a national cultural policy. There's been immense debate whether it should have one, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have a cultural framework. It doesn't mean that there's legislation that is associated. It doesn't mean that, for example, the Australia Council doesn't have its own strategy to deliver on a whole range of things. So I guess it's just although the majority of the countries do operate on a basis of policy and cultural policy, public policy for culture rather, and then strategies, there are many countries that don't. So the models have varied immensely, but I always think that it's a very practical way of looking at policy making if we look at the cultural value chain. And then I can sort of connect it as to how it's been disrupted, not only with COVID, but even before then with the digital era. So as many of you, or probably most of you know, the cultural value chain talks of creation, presentation, distribution, and participation. And the reason why it's important to look at policy making with that cultural value chain framework, which is the one used by UNESCO, is that, and to the point of Rachel, it is very much about ensuring stakeholder engagement, or I believe everybody said it, because there's a diversity of actors in each of those groups that are key enablers or participants to ensuring that that cycle is dynamic. So whether it's the artists that are creating, whether it's the presenting venues, platforms that are presenting work, whether it's the distributing, the publishing houses, those in the music industry or other sorts of creative industries that are ensuring that that is being disseminated. And then it's the actual participation and the responsibility of cultural policy that also has to ensure, or should ensure, that all citizens can have a cultural life that is fulfilled, if you look at it from a cultural rights perspective. So if we look at what happened with the digital era, what used to be a linear process has become a much more disrupted process in that you had artists that were also, or you had audiences that were participating in the development of art. You had artists that were jumping the presentation and going straight into the distribution. There's a whole range of different ways in which the cultural value chain was being realized with these digital means that no longer required the sort of the linear approach. And so that has created quite a significant disruption when it comes to cultural policy making. So traditional cultural policy looked at all of the principles and then looked at what needed, what sort of ecosystem it needed, and kind of proceeded to address systematically in a linear way. You know, if we support and have funding for creation, then we have a pool of money that is going to be supporting or, you know, create the opportunities for there to be a range of cultural institutions that can present work and so on. Even that has had to be rethought. And then we get COVID.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, it was exactly what I was going to ask. How do you feel that COVID is going to change policies, change strategies, and how will it shape the future of policy? What kind of are the main trends which you are observing from your end?
So it's categorically changed it. It's a step change that I don't think one can even say that the financial crisis brought on this, because even the financial crisis didn't actually make our sectors close. So as everybody would have, you know, said or heard, the creative and cultural sectors was the first that had to shut down and will probably be the last one to reopen. So the extent of the impact of this new COVID context, which really is, we are living in it right now and will continue living in it for quite some time, that disruption has been so severe that, to be honest, and this might be a little bit radical to say or too provocative, that anyone who believes that they can return to a business as usual is actually not realizing what has happened, because things are already changing so significantly. And the main reason I say this is because what we have observed, and we've been in contact with all of our members, is that the fault lines that already existed, the issues that were already, you know, trying to be resolved, have been exacerbated. So if we want to talk about concerns around remuneration or status of the artist or cultural workers, that, you know, has demonstrated that if you don't have social safety nets, if you don't have proper structure, if you don't have proper legislation to support the creative and cultural worker sector, then in that gig economy, they're not going to be able to have, you know, broadly speaking, I don't know the specifics of the Malta context, but say broadly, they are probably going to fall through the cracks of some of those stimulus supports that are coming from the whole of government. There are many exceptions, obviously, but that is an example. Or even if we look at the fact that people can't go out, or they are in confinement, the access to digital and technology. I don't remember the exact figure right now off the top of my head, but, you know, it is there is a large population or a large amount of people around the world that don't even have access to internet. So we want to go full digital, and that may be great for some countries, but that further exacerbates that digital that divide between haves and has not.
Thank you.
Being forced to stay at home. Oh, sorry. Yes.
Magdalena, I would actually like to take some reactions from the panel, because I could see everyone was nodding throughout your presentation.
Sorry, there's a lot to say, but you just guide me as to what you'd like me to say and when to stop.
Yeah.
Over to you.
Thank you, Magdalena, for that insight. I would actually I would like to get some feedback from your end, as in some reactions maybe to what Magdalena was saying. Rachel?
Yes, sure. I am in very much in agreement with what Magdalena was saying. And I would go back to say, yes, definitely when you are, let's go a little bit back to this strategy. It totally depends on the type of society that you have in relation to its historical processes. So definitely, if you think about Malta, for example, we are not a policy-based society. We're quite far away from that. So in order to introduce a certain set of principles with very Europeanist principles, which are very much related to rights, a rights-based approach, are not very much part of the way that we think in general. So in order to introduce this type of strategy which is surrounding, policy and rights itself is quite difficult. And of course what we're trying to do is also to reduce inequalities, because that's why you have this specific vision, including art and culture, because we're trying to make sure that we reduce the disparity between the rich and the poor, or the different genders and sexes, so on and so forth. But when it comes to COVID, the pandemic, I think what happened is that we tend to think, and this is also coming maybe from my anthropological lens, that society is static. And perhaps we've had periods, post-war periods, where there was some form of economic stability, and that stayed with us. And of course, we're talking about also the baby boomers who entered even into unemployment, and they had a certain element of predictability and stability. However, with, yes, the financial crisis post-2008, there was a shift. Malta wasn't as hardly hit because, again, of the type of society that we are, a very tightly kinship-based society. So even the money and the income has always been invested within. So that has made a very big difference. But I think with this health pandemic that we have, we just realized that there is no consistency, that change is perhaps a common constant throughout. Mm-hmm. And perhaps we need to now embrace that transformation, which has already happened. And yes, I agree completely with Magdalena. No, we can't be going back to business as usual. We're already in the change. Exactly. We are already in the new. It's just a matter of organizing ourselves and making sure, even when it comes to bring it back to the art sector, talking to banks, for example, and making sure that artists can benefit from social loans in the same way that homeowners who want to get a bank loan for their mortgage can, benefit from exactly. such, loans which are more open and inclusive.
Exactly. On that note, I would like to introduce in the conversation Davinia Galia, who is the Managing Director of ARC Research and Consultancy. Davinia, I would like your opinion about this particular aspect, about what you envisage is going to change in relation to, or should change in relation to cultural policy and strategy now, considering all these changes and maybe considering also what happened historically in terms of cultural policy and the sectors. Davinia?
Thank you very much, Elaine. Thank you for inviting me, and hi to all. A lot of it has been said already in this regard. And I agree with everything that has been said by all the speakers. The only thing perhaps I just want to comment on is I like to approach, actually, I don't want to talk about problems, but I want to speak about challenges that we perhaps through policy can be overcome. I think that policy, the new policy and the new strategy, the new cultural policy for Malta and the new strategy of the Arts Council is actually very timely, and I'm sure has been a hugely difficult task within this pandemic time for the writers. But as we know, obviously, it's a very much a bottom-up approach. So I have no doubt that it will address the needs and priorities of Malta and, go forth from there. What I do want to say is that perhaps turn to the European perspective it's also a time of change for European cultural policy, I suppose. And I want to point out here, like Magdalena pointed out, for Australia, there's no actual cultural policy, she said, for the country. Europe does not have a cultural policy for Europe, so it's up to the individual nation states to develop its own cultural policy. Obviously, there are principles, rights and principles that we adhere to as Europeans, and that our cultural policies are all based on. The new Creative Europe program, for example, is something I would like to speak about, because I think the new policy needs to look at what all these changes that are happening because of COVID, and try, and I suppose struggle, to keep up to date with the quick changes that are going around in the world at the moment. It's not easy. The new Creative Europe 21 to 27 is, about to be announced. Hopefully the program will start this year. But there's been so much change going on that it's been very difficult for the Commission to see this through, I'm sure. And also we need to follow what's going on with the new Green Deal. I think that's a really important thing in terms of change, in terms of sustainability, to ensure that our new policy and strategies are up to date with what's happening basically in the European picture in this way. We're also speaking about the new European Bauhaus, which is again helping the sector come together with sustainability, and in that bringing citizens closer to the Green Deal, basically. So these are, I think, all aspects that, from a cultural policy perspective, we can help to, I suppose, tick the boxes of the larger agenda that that the world faces in its crisis at the moment. Also, besides economic and social, whatever, it's also about environmental. I think that's really, really important at the moment.
Lavinia, one other question from my end. So back to the cultural policy in Malta and kind of its development, its implementation over the years. So what, in your opinion, is its effectiveness and its rapport with the cultural sector? What's your take on that?
I think it was a start. I think Rachel, the anthropologist,
yes,
said the right thing, in that I think our country is just starting post-independence, whatever, hangover, the kind of way forward to how can I say, understand what principles, and also I would say kind of looking at a cultural rights lens. That's what policies are about. And I think we're learning that, yes, we've come a long way from 2011 now, and there are a lot of changes. I think what was really, really important was that we had this kind of overarching policy where our funding schemes especially could really address the sector's priorities and needs, because at the end of the day, what we fund becomes our culture, and we need to be funding our priorities and needs for the culture, for the country. And I think that's really, really important.
Thank you, Lavinia. So what's your opinion, Mario? Obviously, you have observed, as we mentioned in the introduction, you have observed this process. So what was its effectiveness, you think, and the changes it brought about?
Lavinia is right when she said that Europe, as EU, does not have a cultural policy. But we must understand that EU proposed and the member states accepted the new European agenda for culture. We have also to take into consideration that UNESCO, which is very active as well, and it has the Sustainable Development Goals, which also affect culture. And Davinia mentioned the new Bauhaus, which is quite really an interesting concept, because now we're not speaking sort of culture in a silo, as if it doesn't have any kind of relationship with other areas. It is mentioning archaeology, mentioning science, mentioning technology, mentioning environment. So especially after the Davos Declaration of 2018, the relationship between culture, architecture, and environment is becoming much more important. And obviously, if we have to be relevant in this policy, we have to take all this into consideration, because otherwise we are irrelevant before we even publish it.
Exactly.
So these are issues, international issues, that we have to accept and we have to address, because obviously we have our obligations as a country, but we also need to be also forward-looking.
Exactly, exactly. And what have you observed in terms of culture economy and the impact of culture on the economy throughout these years? I think this was a major shift for the arts and creativity locally and also obviously internationally. So what have you observed?
No, that's why initially I insisted that the policy is a set of principles, which are our guiding light where we wish, or otherwise, how we need to take decisions.
Mm-hmm.
I think COVID made us become more innovative, the way how we can, our cultural events can reach audiences in methods, which so far, some of them we haven't explored.
Mm-hmm.
We know Heritage Malta, how much they invest in digitization. Last month we had, we didn't have Carnival, but they found a way how we can celebrate Carnival. I know other public culture organizations are tapping online events. So I think the principle remains the same, to reach out as much as possible to the widest possible audience, to have people have access to culture. And we are finding ways and means how we can reach. Before COVID, it was the easiest way out. We have a theater or we have a mass event and we invite people. We do the adverts and people would come. COVID made us think outside the box,
Mm-hmm.
and we start looking at other forms of how we can transmit culture to people.
So you feel that obviously that was the major influence
It is
over
a major influence.
what's
I
happened
think-
and what will happen.
I think culture, the main problem is going to be post-COVID, is how to attract audiences back, especially to theaters and to cinemas. I think that is going to be a challenge, because people have found a way, an alternative way, which until pre-COVID never took it so seriously. Now, obviously, they are finding it easier to access culture through other means. So that is going to be a big challenge. I'm sure we can overcome it, but it's going to be quite difficult, especially in the initial months. Then things will go back probably to normal.
Exactly. Probably there's still that yearning to actually go to a live performance and still enjoy theater or whatever in its original element. So yeah, that could possibly be the case. And I would like to introduce now Catherine Tabone, who is the Executive Director at the Valletta Cultural Agency. Catherine, you obviously, I would like actually your reaction to what Mario just said, because I know that as an entity you have been quite trying to find solutions for this in a very active way. So I would like your opinion about that, but also I would like your perspective in terms of the European Capital of Culture platform and how that contributed in the strategy and policy area from your end.
Okay, so Elaine, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here and to discuss these very important matters for all of us with you and with the other people who have joined us here. To answer your first question, yes, we have been very, very active in trying to find solutions and in trying to think outside the box to make sure that while respecting the recommendations and guidelines of the health authorities, we still hold as many events as possible. It has not been easy. In fact, this has affected us a lot in terms of the way we present our events, in terms of the expenditure also that goes into producing an event. I'll just mention one particular project, which is a flagship project of ours, which has ended up costing immensely more, but we believe that the importance of going on, of keeping the cultural wheel rotating, as it were, is beyond any cost. So the benefits that this gives to not just to the economy, but also to us as human beings, the importance of leaving culture accessible and of creating quality cultural events in these very difficult times are priceless. So we have one of our flagship projects, which is an opera, which was listed as the second best work of contemporary classical music written in the 21st century by George Benjamin. It's called Written on Skin. We were planning to have a massive audience at the MCC. Unfortunately, that cannot take place. In order to bring the singers over, we have to quarantine them in a corridor country, which of course increases the costs immensely. We have to pay for PCR tests and all that. But the positive light at the end of the tunnel is that ultimately we will have to reinvent this as a TV broadcast, which means also that we will have a document that lasts beyond COVID of all of this effort. So yes, I mean, it's not easy, it's very challenging, it's very difficult, but as long as you have the means and as long as you have the will to do it, there are many different solutions which can result in very unexpected benefits as well. Yes, so with regard to other events, we have tried to concentrate mostly on small gatherings, and when that has not been possible, which sometimes it hasn't, we have gone online, as I think many other public culture organizations have opted to do. For us, this is a very different scenario from what we were used to with Valletta 18, because I'm sure that most of the people who are with us on the panel have attended some of our events or heard about Valletta 18 at least. And we were accustomed to having all these events taking place in Valletta and all over Malta constantly, sometimes more than one a day. So the shift has been incredible. Not just for us as producers, but also for the audience. We still are doing events, not just us, but also the other PCOs, but people have now become more thirsty, I find, for culture, which in a way is a very positive thing, and which I hope this thirst will be able to be quenched in a way or another very, very soon, or in not such a distant future. So that is my answer to not a very exhaustive answer, but I think I try to stick to the main points to your question. And the other question, if you would kindly repeat that, please.
Yes, basically, I would like to take us back to kind of the argument about policy, about strategy, and you've obviously we have experienced the capital of culture, and I would like your perspective about how that actually influenced, shaped the creative ecology locally, this
Okay.
experience.
All right. So let's start with some statistics. I'm not a very big fan of statistics, but when they are researched very well, they can provide a very good basis for discussion. So taking us back to Valletta 18, we had commissioned an independent study by KPMG, which are renowned auditors. And they tried, amongst other things, to quantify the effect, the economic effect of Valletta 18, of all the events that we did for Valletta 18, the promotion that went hand in hand with Valletta 18. And the figures were very encouraging. So I'll just quote a few figures, so I won't bore people to death with statistics. But basically, the total expenditure for Valletta 18, directly and indirectly, was around 325 million, and the output ranged between 511 million to 678 million. I think the benefits that brings are unquestionable. And the same thing, when you think about it in terms of GDP, the difference that it made to the GDP was about 1.6%. So when it comes to full-time jobs, there was an increase of 2.73% in full-time jobs. So definitely Valletta 18 did move things, did change things, it acted as a catalyst. But I need to emphasize that it was not just Valletta 18 on its own. This was a collective national effort. So it was not just the events that we did as a foundation, but it was also the events that the public and private institutions did for the 2018 year that contributed to this massive economic effect. So this is something that I would like to keep in mind. Also when it comes to discussing the benefits of culture, especially in times of COVID, because unfortunately we have seen perhaps more in other countries than in ours, thankfully, but the first sector that is affected very negatively when a problem crops up is unfortunately culture and the arts. So there have been cuts, budget cuts in other countries. Theaters have unfortunately closed down. And sometimes that is the result also of a lack of appreciation of the concrete and tangible benefits of culture. Yeah. I think an exercise such as the one that we mentioned, I believe it was very important for the decisions that were taken in Malta when it comes to the budget that was allocated for culture and the creative industries this year, despite all the economic issues that we are going through. In terms of policy, when it came to Valletta 18, as probably most of you would know, I joined Valletta 18 in 2017. So I was not part and parcel of the preparation towards the ECOC year. But the people who preceded me were very strong on policy, and they did their research very well. So I'm sure that they had consulted, because I still remember some of these consultation exercises with the PCOs and local and international stakeholders as well. So the whole program was very much linked and entwined into the cultural policy of that time. Yeah. And I think it was also, in a way, also visionary in terms that it looked beyond the cultural policy. Yeah.
Catherine, unfortunately, we're nearing the end of this discussion. I'll have to stop you there, but thank you very much for this contribution, for your contribution, and for actually raising this specific point of collaboration. I think we were hinting at this earlier on during the discussion, and hinting at the fact that policy sometimes seems at least a very distant concept almost. There needs to be, and I know that you are all working in and making the biggest efforts to bring the policy closer to the sector. Adrian, I know that you have also researched this aspect in your work. So how do we avoid policy and strategies becoming too far away from the creative sector?
So a lot of things that have been just said have alluded to this factor quite well, especially the part about the impact of COVID and how the impact of COVID has led to certain shifts in the way we think about cultural participation, for example. So for starters, in terms of policy making, most of the time we immediately think about government policy making. So at a government level, when it comes to public policy at least, we think about the bureaucratic aspect, ministries, for example, public agencies, etc., that are involved in the policy making aspect. But at the same time, at a more grounded level, people that are involved in the sector and people that are also not involved directly in the sector, in the cultural sector, also do make policy in a way, even unknowingly, through their own everyday practices, especially if there's something which is currently not officially and institutionally addressed. If there's a gap in some way, some missing link of sorts, it's somehow, if there's the need for it, the sector somehow finds a way to address it. And sometimes, not always, that can lead to a more formalized version of that way of doing things. So then that's why it's important that, as Rachel and Mario have said, that we keep on being close to the sector and keep on being quite with our ears to the ground, so to speak, on what is happening and what the needs are. A particular barrier, maybe, or an imagined barrier that's most of the time we come across in this process of dealing with the institutions and the sector, is the way the two groups envision each other. So you can get an extreme where the institutions envision the people in the sector as being outright resistant to everything, or they envision the sector as being completely supportive of everything. Of course, in reality, it's much more nuanced than that. You can have certain contexts where certain groups are resistant, certain contexts where the same groups are supportive. And on the other end, you have the artists and the people that are involved actively in the sector are imagined by the conventional policymakers, institutional policymakers, as I mean the other way around actually. The way policymakers envision people that are involved in the sector as being quite laissez-faire, etc. So there needs to be. So these are the extreme types of portrayals, so to speak.
And based probably on non-communication or lack of maybe communication, which brings us back to what Rachel was saying, the importance of communication, of a bottom-up approach in this case.
Yes, exactly. And like on the other hand, the sector may envision the institutions as being distant, as having a fixed essence, and as having quite a presence which is quite unshakable and static, and which is not the case. There's a certain degree of dynamism and flexibility which comes with a strong policy-making approach.
Exactly. There's certainly a lot more to say about the process. So it's been very interesting to get to know the process and also what happened and different approaches. I would like to dedicate the last 5 minutes of the session to Ms. Marianne Kauki, who is with us via Zoom. Marianne is the Director of Funding and Strategy at Arts Council Malta. She has been following this conversation, and she will be providing us with basically a roundup of what is happening at Arts Council Malta in relation to policy and strategy work. Marianne?
Yes, hello. Thank you. It was lovely listening to every single intervention, and very interesting and mind-opening as well. Basically, yes, very exciting time for Arts Council Malta with the creation of the design of the new strategy 2025. Basically, if I have to sum up what was said today, I think I would give a very clear reflection of what Strategy 2025 is all about. There is more to it, but I could sum it up very interestingly in 9 words that were used today more than often. Basically, these 9 words are bottom up, research, alive, dialogue, transformation, shift, needs, relevance, cross-sectoral. These 9 words are key to Strategy 2025. And as Arts Council, yes, for the next 5 years, it would be it will be our Bible type of thing, and we're going to stick, yes, to these 9 key words, something that will remain alive, something that will remain transformative, that can shift according to the needs, and that remains relevant. We're looking into the cross-sectoral because, yes, it's not living in silos. We do this by continuous informed research, and also we keep the bottom-up approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne, for that roundup of today's session and of what we said. And with that, we are going to conclude the session. I would like to thank Arts Council Malta for hosting another ACM Hangouts. Thank you to our guests for being with us today and contributing to this conversation. Feel free to leave us a message on our Facebook page if you have any comments or if you would like to discuss further. We'll see you next month for another session of the ACM Hangouts. Take care.